My name is Reis Habito. I'm the International Program Director of the Museum of World Religions, and I also am the US Director of the Elijah Interfaith Institute.
And your field of specialty is?
My field of specialty is Buddhist studies, especially Chinese Buddhism.
Okay, so that's great. Let's talk today about you co-wrote the chapter on memory in the book on memory and hope that we did together. So this is a great opportunity for us to revisit that theme of memory. Let's start by asking a broad question. Tell me about memory in Buddhism. Is it something important?
Well, of course, it has a double aspect. Memory is important to remember the teachings of the Buddha, the different practices of meditation, and so on. Memory is important to remember the history of our teaching and the teachers. But at the same time, Buddhists always understand that memory is something conditioned, and so we cannot, we have to find a way of overcoming memory, actually.
So let's do this in slow motion. I think you just gave a very important thesis here, but let's try and unpack it bit by bit. So you spoke about memory of the Buddha, memory of the teaching, and then problematizing memory. Let's begin with the positive aspects of memory. Tell us more about those.
Well, the positive aspects are that the Buddha gave us very detailed teachings on how we can become awakened by following those teachings and methods. And so in the early times and up to today, monks had to memorize those texts. We have a center in Myanmar where the little monks from morning to night are memorizing texts and reciting them, so that this memory about the teachings becomes something bodily that's deeply instilled in them, and so then they don't have to think about that any longer because it becomes part of who they are. At the same time, it's understood that memory has a wide field of implication. We don't only memorize teachings, but we also have a memory that forms us from even before we were born. So that's the memory, that's our interaction with our families, with the society around us, and so on. And that memory, of course, is conditioned and changes all the time. So part of the practice of meditation is to realize that our I, me, my identity that's based on memory is something that's conditional. And we try to overcome that.
It's interesting. I keep trying to emphasize the parts that, shall we say, non-Buddhists can resonate with, and you keep hurrying back to the other part. So you study, I take it that it's not so much a memory. What's interesting to hearing you is that it's not so much a memory of history as it is a memory of scripture. In other words,
Yes.
It's not events that are remembered, but teachings, and teachings are then expressed in scripture, and therefore it's scripture that's remembered, and through that the teaching. Is that correct?
That is correct. Of course, the person of the Buddha is also remembered. The stories about his life, about his previous lives, and so on. But that all serves the same purpose. How do we use that to transform our own lives and reach enlightenment?
So memory is inextricably linked with teaching.
That's right.
Okay, so
in the positive sense, but then there is another sense of memory where, okay, you want to talk about that later?
Yeah. So and what about Buddhist history itself? Is that something that's important to remember?
It's important to remember in the sense that it gives us trust. For example, when you start a meditation practice, it takes a lot of time and effort. So you need to have trust and faith in the whole line of the teachers ever since the Buddha that they really transmitted the right spirit. And so that memory is based on trust and is deepening trust and faith.
Okay. So if memory is connected to scripture, then memory in many ways really is the foundation of the path of Buddhism. But then you're telling us that there's just the opposite move where memory has to somehow be transcended and undermined. Tell us more about that.
It has to be seen through. So in Buddhist teaching, there is these different levels of consciousness, and one of the levels is called the storehouse of all the seeds of memory. And that storehouse of all the seeds of memory doesn't only contain what you learned through the scriptures or through your teachers, but it also contains all of the interactions that you have with people in your present life. And it's understood that it also contains all the interactions you had in previous lives. And it's that kind of storehouse of memory that has to be clearly realized, and also that has to be seen through as something that conditions your sense of I, me, mine. And that sense in Buddhism is considered to be an illusion.
So would it be fair to say that the Buddhist path is a kind of dance between remembering and forgetting?
Yes, remembering is important, but also it's important to know that what we remember is conditioned through so many factors.
Okay, but then is it forgetting that's the counterpoint to memory, or how would you define the counterpoint to memory?
It depends what you forget. If you forget some grievances that you have, that's considered something very positive. But if you forget the methods of practice, that's of course not so positive.
No. What I hear you saying is that the positive side is the memory of the teaching, and then
Yes.
but what has to be forgotten is what you call the I, me, my. So all the storehouse of personal memories, all the grievances. So really, the spiritual evolution is you walk on 2 feet. One foot is remembering, one foot is forgetting. Is that?
Yes. Yeah, you could express it in that way. Yes.
That's very special. I don't think we will have any other religious tradition that features it that way. So we see here something very important about the particularity of the Buddhist tradition. So let's talk about the negative memory. So how does one get beyond it? How does one forget it? How does one transcend it? How does one see through it?
That is a function of your power of concentration during meditation. And that power of concentration leads you to a state that's called samadhi, really in deep meditation. And those memory formations that come up as grievance, as hurt, as anger, get dissolved in the state of samadhi. It's as if you had a knot, and the knot somehow opens up by itself.
So you no longer remember, or you lose the negative charge that's associated with the memory?
Yes, you lose the negative charge. We say in English, forget it. It means the same. It doesn't mean that you actually forget it, but you are no longer conditioned by it. You are able to let go.
Let's take this into the question of relations between different religions.
Mm-hmm.
How would either side, both the positive and the negative, apply in relation to other religions?
Well,
or other group situations. I mean, we have political situations, any situations of group conflict, whether religious or political or social or whatever. How would one apply this particular perspective, this particular wisdom to such situations?
Well, the particular wisdom of Buddhism is that deep down the level of truth, there is no such thing as enemies or as people, as subjects and objects, those against us and those for us. Deep down, that's already an illusion. So
what is there if there isn't that duality?
If the duality is on the relative level of truth, the absolute level of truth is there is no self and other.
Oh, it's not that we're all one.
It's not that we are all one. There is you have to go even beyond this idea of one. There is just no such thing as self and other. There is this empty, infinite horizon that's called emptiness.
Also from the one to the zero.
From the one to the zero, exactly. But that's hard to explain in words. But so, of course, memory, historic events condition our memory, but we have on one hand side also condition our relations to others. So on one hand side, we recognize that those memories are also formed through a tradition in the way of these how these relations are told. And the question is always, how can we tell or fashion memory in a way that it doesn't create enemies? So on the Buddhist side, the question is, how do I lead my entire life in a way that I would not consider anybody else an enemy or hurt them in any way? So that's a very important teaching. Now, when it comes to the fact that Buddhists feel, of course, there have been Muslim invasions, there has been that history. Buddhists are trying to not give in to feelings of enmity towards anyone, but they are also human beings. So sometimes memory can be formed in a negative way through the stories that we tell about each other. And once we realize that the telling of the story is not really the actual fact and is not beneficial to anyone, then that the emotions that are associated with that story have to be overcome. And so again, you have to.
So what is the strategy? Is it telling a counter story, a good story, or it's simply letting loose of the emotional grip of the story so that the story remains, but you're no longer affected by it?
No, it's you let loose of the emotional grip of the story. Here one, I think, important element is also that past, present, and future are also only seen on the relative level. So maybe in the past you had antagonistic relations, let's say, with another religious group. But now you live in the present and you are not allowed to hang on to these conditionings of the past. So how do you live an open presence even with that group that you had considered antagonistic before? It's by opening up and seeking dialogue. And so I think all of the religions have come to the same conclusion, that the memories that have formed us are not helping us in dealing wisely with our religious friends from the other religious traditions.
But it would require kind of a mass meditation movement of all the Buddhist practitioners to really let go of that. How does that really happen?
Yes, of course, there's always the ideal and then there's the reality. I mean, we are seeing things going on in Myanmar right now that are far from the ideal, and they are connected with how we tell stories about each other.
So give me an example of where this has worked well.
Well, an example where it works well is if you take the Dalai Lama and you see his attitude towards the Chinese government. It has always been an attitude of non-confrontation and raising compassion even for those who persecute us. So that's very, very predominant in Buddhism, especially the Mahayana form of Buddhism, where you say you learn through enemies, and the greatest danger is to ever forget your compassion and your understanding for your enemy, because you see the enemy also as conditioned. And so there is memory in that sense, helps you to see, or in the Buddhist teaching of memory, it helps you to see the conditioned being and the interconnected being of everything that exists. So if you have an enemy, how is that person related to you, and how can you transform this relationship that's based on conflict into one that is based on harmony?
You've just introduced a new notion you didn't tell us about before. Now there's a new notion that came up in the conversation, the memory of the interconnectedness. You hadn't mentioned this before. Tell us more about this dimension of memory.
Well, this is really the enlightenment experience of the Buddha. When the Buddha awakened under the Bodhi tree, it says he could see his own past lives, and he could see the past lives of all the other beings on this earth, and he realized that we are all deeply interconnected. And that's the Buddhist teaching that says every being in this world has been your mother or father at one point of time. And yes, and so this awareness of interconnectedness conditions everything that you do in your practice. And that's why it is so important not to harm any being, because of the interconnectedness and the karmic consequences of doing harm to others. It will ultimately fall back on you.
So this is a whole other teaching than just letting go of the negative quality of memories. Basically, what you're doing is you're cultivating a positive dimension. It's not like you're letting go. You're actually cultivating the positive awareness of interconnectedness. So it's a much...
That's absolutely right, yes. And but for that to be effective, you have to let go of all the blockages. And the blockages are our negative memories and the ideas and notions that are formed around that. And you let go of the blockages, as I said, in meditation and deep samadhi. It's not something where you can sit down at the table and say, now I let go of this idea. It doesn't work.
But couldn't you simply cultivate the awareness of the interconnectedness and its positive benefits even without the meditation?
Oh yes, that's basic Buddhist practice. I don't know if you have heard of the Loving Kindness Sutra that's recited in Buddhist countries every day, and even children memorize it, where it says, "May all beings be happy, may they all be well, may they all be without any harm." And like a mother takes care of her only child, that kind of heart you should have towards all living beings. So that is the practice that is also remembered, of course.
I see. So in theory at least, uh, Buddhism does have a teaching of some higher memory that is helpful to social relations that doesn't depend on, millions of people meditating. They might simply internalize the teaching and act upon it.
Yes, this higher teaching is love, loving kindness, and compassion. But the question is, how can we really fully develop this potential of loving kindness and compassion? And in the Buddhist understanding, that is only possible if we are no longer limited by our understanding of an I, me, mine, as opposed to an thou out there, and all the other dualisms that way of thinking imply.
You mentioned the Dalai Lama. I know you're closely connected to Dharma Master Shindao from Taiwan, the founder of the Museum of World Religions. Is there some story in his own journey that's relevant to this conversation?
Are you speaking about Dharma Master Shindao now? Or
Yeah. Is there something? Yeah.
I think his whole life is based on, well, you know that he grew up as a child soldier. He lost his parents in Myanmar, became a child soldier, and then at the age of 16 came to Taiwan with the army. And he said that his enlightenment experience, or his really dedication to Buddhist practice, came when he heard about this figure of great compassion and enlightenment that is called Guanxi in Chinese, or Kanzeon in Japanese, or Avalokiteshvara in Sanskrit. And it really means this being of limitless insight and compassion that flows out of that. And he decided to devote his whole life to the cultivation of this limitless insight into emptiness and compassion that flows from that. And so he tattooed even that he would never rest before he couldn't repay Kanon's or Guanxin's kindness. In other words, he dedicated his whole life to this search of really opening up the self to such a point that there is no sense of self and other that exists anymore. And he says that is really that realization that really sets free the energy of love that is needed to transform this world. And his whole teaching and his whole activities, lots of them are based on that insight. But he needed to meditate 12 years on graveyards and fast 2 years in a cave to really come to that very deep realization. And that's why Buddhists say it's one thing of understanding all of this intellectually. It's another way of putting it to practice.
So practice leads me then to what I think is my final question, which is, how does this translate into ritual? So tell us, we have the theory. This is a great point to move from the theory to the practice. What is the practice, either by way of ritual or meditation, or you mentioned some of the chanting? What are the dimensions of both the positive memory and the undoing of the attached memory? Tell us more about how this translates in the practice of the religion.
Well, of course, there are many different rituals in the Buddhist tradition. There are rituals for healing. There are rituals to help the deceased find relief in a future life. There are rituals after accidents and so on. But the rituals that are practiced by the nuns and monks in the monastery, one of the very important rituals is the 3 months period of meditation that usually happens between February and May, let's say. And that, so the whole meditation period is considered, or introduced at least, as a ritual. And it is a ritual because it's repeated every year. So you started by preparing, by already reading the scriptures, reciting the scriptures for weeks even before you start that meditation period. So the recitation of the scriptures is a very important ritual in that sense, or practice. So sometimes ritual and practice, it's hard to distinguish exactly how they are quite different in Buddhism. A different important ritual is the prostrations in front of the Buddha. People do up to thousands of prostrations.
What's the point? As a Jew who doesn't prostrate before idols, explain to me, what's the point?
Yes, they are not considered idols, but they are considered the images of your true self. So they are considered to represent to you true insight and true compassion, nothing but that. It's not in being out there.
So the ritual of prostration is part of the.
It's part of the practice to
it's part of the discovery of the true self. Did you say?
Yes, it's part of the practice of the search of the true self, but also of the practice of the true self.
I thought there was no true self. I'm confused.
Oh, there is a true self, but the true self is no longer limited by the small I, me, mine, or this body understanding.
Forgive me, I thought the whole teaching of Buddhism was that there was no self.
There is no self in the now we get in linguistic distinctions here, but it's a self that is commonly understood. So it says in those building blocks that form our understanding of self, which are the bodily elements, and then our feelings, our perceptions, our wish, our consciousness. In all of those building blocks, there is no I to be distinguished.
But rather, what does one discover when one goes beyond it? That greater self, which is the interconnected self?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that greater self is as vast as the universe and beyond.
So ritual of prostration is a means of recognizing this?
Yes. A ritual prostration is a way of purification. And a way of purification lets you reach that awareness.
What about chanting? It would seem to be very, very, very basic for memorializing, no?
Yes, the chanting is very basic. So you interiorize the teachings through the chanting, and you also repeat the teachings. So the more you chant, the more you become familiar with the teachings. But another function of chanting is really the concentration, just to concentrate on the chanting and not to concentrate on what you had for breakfast yesterday or something like that. So it's also to train your power of concentration and your focus, your mindfulness.
You spoke about rituals of monastics. What about rituals of lay people?
Oh, the lay people have many rituals. I think in Buddhist countries, the most important ritual is probably to care for their deceased ancestors in their homes.
No, I'm talking about rituals of memory, not rituals of Buddhist life. Rituals related to memory.
Rituals of memory is to recite, as I said, in the Theravada countries, the Metta Sutra is taught to lay persons, children already in the schools. So when you recite that, it helps to deepen your memory, but it also helps to, of course, personalize or integrate the teachings. So there are other rituals where you bring flowers to the Buddha or where you bathe the Buddha in water. And all those are symbolic actions, flowers and waters and Buddha. It's just this purity, this inner purity that you have to remind yourself of. And also the offering that's implied. So offering, giving of yourself is also considered an important ritual. And it's expressed in those ways.
Excellent. A wonderful overview to the place of memory in Buddhism. If we had one or two texts to read on that we would want to recommend, what would you recommend as texts to read? Primary text, I mean.
You mean text on memory or?
Oh, texts within the tradition, ritual texts, yeah, scriptural texts that are relevant for
this. Scriptural text. So I would say the Metta Sutta, so the Sutra of Loving Kindness for the Theravada tradition, and for the Mahayana tradition, the Heart Sutra.
Are they long?
No, that's why I'm mentioning them. They are not, so they're easy to manage, and they show quite distinct aspects. So the Sutra of Loving Kindness is about loving kindness, that meditation, and the Heart Sutra is about seeing through this dualism of form, our limited existence in this phenomenal world, and the absolute.
So even though they don't use the term memory, but really they go to the core of our conversation today.
They go to the core of our conversation because these are, I think, probably the texts that are the most memorized in the Buddhist countries.
They're the most memorized, and their content also helps us to transform our memory.
Absolutely.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.